Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second week of summer school. It is my great pleasure this morning to introduce to you Professor Roger Southall. Professor Southall is an emeritus professor in sociology at Wits University, where he was the head of department for a number of years. Before that, he was Professor of Political Studies at Rhodes University between the years 1989 and 2001. He was also the Distinguished Research Fellow at the Human Sciences Research Council between 2001 and 2007. Professor Southall also enjoyed quite a distinguished career at universities in Uganda, Lesotho, Canada, and the UK. He is a research associate in politics at the University of Cape Town, and in 2013 he was appointed to the Van Zyl-Slabbert Chair in Politics and Sociology. And I don't know if you are aware of it, but this chair was particularly created to honor Dr. Frederick Van Zyl-Slabbert and his commitment to an open democratic society, his excellence in public service, and his research and teaching interests in politics and sociology. So it's quite an honor for anybody to be appointed as chair of the Van Zyl-Slabbert Chair. Professor Southall is very well known. He has published extensively on African and South African politics, political economy, and international labor and development. He is the author and editor of more than a dozen books. His list of publications was so long, I thought I'm not even going to try and summarize it. It's like huge. He also founded the HSRC State of the Nation project, and he is also the editor of the International Journal of Contemporary African Studies. The Black Middle Class is his latest book, besides the numerous other articles that he's probably written in between. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I was not responsible for that. Where should we just put it? Up here.
Sorry. Just put it there.
Right.
That's fine.
Morning, everybody.
Can you all hear?
Yeah, if you can't hear me, shout. Thank you for expressing interest in this topic. This is my book. I don't know whether it's on sale here at all. But anyway, that's it. It's Jacana if you're interested. And so I'll be...
It is for sale outside.
It is for sale outside. I'll be talking to some of the ideas in that book. I won't be able to cover everything. I may try to cover too much, in which case you must shout at me and we'll have to cut it down. What I'm simply going to do, first of all, is to start off with a little bit of razzmatazz, something from YouTube, just for nearly 4 minutes, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we should be interested in the black middle class, and how we might think of defining it. And I'm a little bit nervous of this because you're not sociologists, but unfortunately I'm a sociologist and I have to think of how we define things. So I'll start with the razzmatazz, and then I'll get into the more boring stuff, and then after that we'll be dealing with empirical stuff about the education system, the black middle class and the ANC, the politics of the black middle class, and so on. So let's see if we get going with this.
He gets ready for Saturday morning cricket an hour before he has to. He practices his swing, telling anyone...
Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, welcome to our house.
Johan, is dit jouw huis?
Ja, ek bly hier so en ek werk ook hier so. Mense sukkel tot meneer Smit waarvoor ek werk. Hy help ons. Hier is die toilet.
As you can see, we like, the French style. We've been more inspired by Louis XV.
The difference now is that now we stay in a bigger house, we've got bigger cars, and we didn't inherit that, we earned that. I think that's where the difference is.
Wat kan er? Jy het al intussen 'n bietjie reg gemaak, ek probeer dat dit net weer leefbaar is.
This is our bathroom. Normally put the, water with some bubbles, foam bath. And we relax here after, you know, a long day's work.
Vroeger was dit baie beter geweest. Toe dit nog die, kom ons sê die ou regering was. Ja. Sou sê dit was baie beter geweest. Aan alle.
One South Africa, two realities. Meet Pindi and Chepo. Black, born and raised.
I'm not quite sure what happened there.
Yeah. It's going back.
That's it. That's more like it. Yeah. Can we...
Since 1994, black South Africans slowly made their way into the mainstream economy. But years of oppression and poor education meant that many lacked the skills to earn a decent income. However, this is starting to change with the emergence of the black middle class.
All estimates I've seen point towards the lower income race groups, the black, coloured and Asian having grown faster than the white group, suggests that the inequality gap is narrowing. It's obviously a process though, we are still a highly unequal country.
During 1994 and 2004, the black middle income group grew to 1.7 million people. These are South Africans that earn an income of between $1,000 and $5,000 within a household and own a car or a house. According to research by the Unilever Institute, this figure has more than doubled. There are currently 4.2 million black middle income earners in South Africa.
They've been catapulted into middle-class life. Just the understanding of financial instruments and understanding of implications of using some of those financial instruments. When you grow up second and third generation middle class, you grow up in an environment where your parents are talking about credit.
Black middle income earners make up over 50% of South Africa's overall middle class, with annual spending of $40 billion. This category of earners contributes significantly to the economy, but they're also showing signs of maturing as they are now accumulating assets.
Without the black middle class, I think our economy would have seen a much more sluggish growth number. Sluggish as it is now, it would have been far more had this particular consumer not being driving the economy, as it were.
A recent survey by one of South Africa's leading banks shows that black home ownership has risen to 32%, an increase from 23% since 2005. White ownership dropped from 57% to 46.5% in the same period.
The so-called white population group still a big buyer in these so-called white suburban areas or former white suburban areas, not far from 50%. And then the other groups, the previously disadvantaged groups being the black, coloured and Indian groups, making up the other half.
But there are challenges. This group is burdened by high amounts of debt and the responsibility of taking care of extended family members.
One other important aspect too that's perhaps holding this emerging middle class back with their progress is that a lot of them are first generation middle and upper income groups, which means that they have a lot of low income family members which they still support. So whereas the white population group has this intergenerational wealth build-up and most of us don't have to support our parents.
It seems the gap between rich and poor is narrowing. But in order to grow the black middle class, South Africa's economic growth will have to pick up. Sumitra Nadu, CCTV, Johannesburg.
So, are we just get back to the... How do I get rid of that? Right, well, that... Sorry if it was a little bit low in volume, but that showed us some of the themes which we'll be touching upon: size, housing, in terms of debt and so on, aspiration. But I'm not going to be talking so much about that today. I'm going to, first of all, just to touch upon how we think of the black middle class and I think why we might be interested in it. I grew up in a rural area outside Nelspruit. I'm a lot better off than my parents. My children will be much better off than me. They have to be. Gloria. Why should we be interested in the middle class? Why are you sitting here today? Obviously because South Africa is in a state of very rapid change, and I think one of the most noticeable facets of the changes since 1994 has been the growth of the black middle class. The expansion of the black middle class, not merely in size, but outwards from the former black townships into our suburbs, the movement of blacks into the former white schools, and obviously the movement of blacks into business. There has also been a very significant growth of black presence, understandably, with democracy into government, the public service now, in strict demographic terms, in other words, in terms of proportion, the proportionate size of blacks within the population and whites and so on, the public service now is demographically representative in strict numerical terms, even though we do find that there is overrepresentation of whites still at the top areas. But the movement of blacks into the higher ranks of the public service has been huge. There has been a movement of whites out of the public service into the private sector, and there has been a decline of the traditional class, which we can talk about later, as I think that will fit into the picture. Why should we be interested in the middle class? Well, traditionally, historically, people have viewed a middle class as important to political stability. It goes back into the Aristotelian tradition. Basically, what Aristotle was arguing was that middle classes were a force for moderation, that they lessened the extremes of political systems, and they brought people together. And many social scientists, picking up on this thought, have argued in modern times that yes, the middle classes are absolutely essential for the building of political stability and for democratization. They argue that an increase in wealth and income and so on brings about it reduces the commitment of lower classes to extreme ideologies. Not everybody accepts that, but it is a strong tradition in social science argument that basically a middle class is absolutely necessary for democracy. I think another factor is that the growth of the middle class globally is becoming a very important factor in terms of the thinking of global institutions like the World Bank and so on. There is a huge debate going on internationally at the moment about global middle classes, much of it in reference to the huge expansion of the middle sector in China. I think the middle class in China is now reckoned to be considerably larger than the South African population overall, which is hardly surprising given the size of China. Huge debate on the growth of the middle classes in India. And this, of course, is preceded by earlier debates about the growth of middle classes in Latin America. In Africa, of course, the middle classes are still a very small proportion of the populations on the whole, but nonetheless, there is, again, much interest in what's going on in Africa generally. There are massive debates about how we define the middle class. But generally, if you're looking at the documentation given by the global institutions, if you just go onto the sites of the World Bank and you Google for middle class and so forth, you'll see very quickly that the World Bank and similar situations seem to be arguing these days that the growth of the middle class is an indicator of development, which in some ways is not very surprising because you're seeing the movement of people into higher living standards, you're seeing the movement of people into higher educational strata, and of course you are seeing the growth of a consumer market, which is extremely important for large multinational corporations and the global institutions and the global economy. So generally, it links up with the huge interest going on about the shift of economic power to the global south, whether in fact the West is declining, whether indeed Donald Trump can do anything about it. There is a lot of emphasis on greater global equity, and there is this huge notion that the middle class somehow is the entrepreneurial class, and they're going to contribute to the global economic, the global economy and global economic welfare. And again, generally, on the whole, the middle class is seen as a counter to authoritarianism. It is seen as spurring the growth of civic society. It is seen as spurring the political protests about people being locked up unfairly, so on and so forth. Is Africa different? Well, I think it is, in the sense that, as I just mentioned, that the middle classes in Africa are generally reckoned to be a lot smaller than they are in the so-called emerging economies of countries like India and China. But the middle classes are small. Some people say middle classes in Africa are a little more than 2% of the population. The World Bank would argue it's considerably larger than that. But there is agreement that the middle classes, even so, in Africa are growing very fast, but they are limited by the colonial nature of the economies, because most African economies are still driven by the sale of commodities and the import of industrial goods. Very noticeable too in Africa, wherever you go, is the huge growth of urbanization, the huge spread of towns, and the improvement for many people in their standards of living, even though I think many of us would look at so-called middle-class homes in many African countries and not want to live in them themselves. So it raises the question, is the South African black middle class different from other African middle classes? And if so, again, the classic question about South Africa, is South Africa in this case, yet again, a special case? So let us think a little bit about this. First of all, let us think about the notion of portraying the black middle class in a still very racially divided society. I did wonder before I started this series whether there would be any frankly black people in the room, and I look around and forgive me if there are one or two, I don't see anybody, which is quite interesting in itself. I was asked when I was launching my book early last year by a young black student from UCT about what right I had to write about the black middle class, which in many ways is a fair enough question. My response was that, well, I think everybody is entitled to write about the French Revolution without living in 1789 and being French. Nonetheless, of course, it does throw up these awkward issues. That question does throw up these awkward issues about how we think about the black middle class and what we're doing when we're thinking about it. And when I am talking about that black middle class, I want to just make it explicit here that I'm taking a narrow definition of black in terms of the way in which African people in this country tend to identify these days as black, because we live in a racially divided society and the counterpart is essentially white. Of course, it wouldn't make any sense to talk about a black middle class in Nigeria because everybody in Nigeria is black. But we still, I think very much, the sense of identity in this country is of a black middle class. But I think that for the way in which the black middle class has been thought about, and I think a little bit came over in the video, is this, I think in some of the literature on the black middle class, especially as it's portrayed in the media, is that somehow the black middle class is somehow exotic. Goodness gracious, look, there's a black man driving a fancy car. Look at these black people moving into these large houses in the suburbs. There's all sorts of questions around that. And I think there are dangers of stereotyping. And the term which has been widely used for the black middle class is a reference to black diamonds. Now, the term black diamonds has been invented by the Unilever Institute in this university, which is basically a marketing does surveys around marketing, and it does very interesting work on black middle class lifestyle. And I think, to be fair to the interesting work which the Unilever Institute has done, that the media has often picked up on what the Unilever Institute has done and in some ways parodied it. And so we get this image of the black diamond, of somebody who has multiple cars, lives in rich houses, and holds big fancy parties and so on. That, of course, does exist, but it is hugely dangerous to suggest that that is the generalizing factor of the black middle class. And I think in many ways the counter question is are not black middle class people just like you and me in terms of their aspirations and what they want for their children and so on and so forth? There is this notion, I think, abroad that simply the black middle class is simply consumption oriented. There is the other suggestion that it's not really a proper bourgeoisie. This notion of the bourgeoisie as having been the historical society which has promoted entrepreneurialism, the growth of capitalism, etc. The suggestion that somehow the present black middle class is not of the same ilk. I think all these things we need to question, we need to think about, because sometimes they latch on to something, but they don't give us the whole picture. The other aspect which I do think we need to think about is when we talk about the black middle class, there are two components of that phrase, black and middle class, obviously. Which matters more? How do people identify? And we'll be seeing that identity is very, very important in terms of the black middle class, and they do identify very often more as black than as middle class. But let us deal with that later. What do we actually mean by the middle class? It's been a huge issue of debate historically, but let's start off with some fairly straightforward stuff. Of course, we think of the middle class as being somewhere in the middle of society, in between. In between what, though? And I think we usually think of the middle class as a segment of society, a category of people in the middle range of a set of hierarchies: income, property, wealth, consumption, occupation, or whatever. It does relate to, I think, particular lifestyles. Many of us will refer to a middle-class lifestyle, and there has been huge interest when people are talking about new middle classes is what do they consume? Huge literature on middle-class consumption and what it means, how people's living standards are changing and how that is changing their tastes and so on. I'm going to Sorry, I have to go in through a little bit of pop sociology here, but obviously if we look at, I think the only way I can think of a black middle class is in terms of what I term the two grand traditions in sociology, one flowing from Karl Marx, and he was talking about social classes which were distinguished by ownership or non-ownership of property, which he termed the means of production. He thought of the middle class as essentially being those people who were in the professions, in the shopkeepers and so on, and he saw them as being squeezed by the class struggle which was eventually going to see the overthrow of capitalism. He saw them as being eventually eliminated, or that's what a simple reading of Marx is. In fact, if you read Marx later on, his later Marx increasingly sees as capitalist societies becoming more differentiated and so on. But of course, the notion that the middle class would be squeezed and eliminated is certainly gone by the board because middle classes have actually increased. So we get to the second grand tradition in sociology, flowing from the German sociologist Max Weber, who was writing in the early years of the late 19th and early 20th century. He distinguished class from status. Class he regarded as essentially based upon around occupation. Status he saw as the way in which people are esteemed, and he could see that there was sometimes a difference between those. So he saw these as cross-cutting social hierarchies. Importantly, in many ways, he expanded Marx's definition. Marx's definition of the middle class was essentially around between those two classes which were property owning and non-property owning. Weber widened the definition of middle class to see them as defined not just by property or wealth, but by income, education, skills, political power. And he did not see any fundamental conflict between the middle classes in society. There are numerous issues around how we think of the middle class, even in terms of the grand traditions. Use of the term is never politically neutral. If we think, for instance, to the last American presidential campaign, the references to the hardships being suffered by the American middle class. And in America, the term middle class is used expansively. It is not fashionable in America to be working class. So virtually everybody is referred to as middle class. But that has a political tinge to it. How do we weigh wealth? How do we weigh income and so on? And how do we relate wealth, income, occupation, and all these other factors to each other to define a middle class? It's a complex issue. How do middle classes relate to the state? How do we differentiate managers from capitalists or lower middle class people like shop assistants from higher levels of the working class? So just to summarize a huge amount of sociology, the middle class has become increasingly differentiated with industrialization, and the middle class may be pulled in different directions. Will they go with the side of the managers, or will they go with the side of the working class, or will they just sit somehow in the middle? They may often be pulled in different ways. They may aspire to move up the ladder, but their objective economic circumstances, like their modest incomes, may be pulling them downwards, partly because the amount of debt they may be in, for instance. We also have to think a little bit about methodology when we're thinking about the middle class. How do you actually measure it? Because measurement is important, and it also helps us to think about how we think about the middle class. If we think, I'm just going to take us very briefly again through the ways in which what I term two ways of looking at the middle class. The first of all, I'm thinking of the middle class as defined essentially by consumption. And I think this is an approach, understandably, of Stat South Africa, who have to count people and decide what sort of categories they go into, and the marketing industry. And basically, they share a broadly common approach, which is to say, we will define the class structure in South Africa according to living standards, in terms of living standards measures. And living standards measures are basically based upon a set of 20 things you may or may not own. Do you own a washing machine? Do you own a car? Do you, or have you, how much education have you consumed, and so on? What goods do you have in your house? Do you have a cell phone? So on and so forth. And it is out of this tradition of looking at these different indicators of lifestyle and consumption that the tradition of the black diamonds comes from. And again, I don't want to parody the notion of black diamonds, but this is where the notion of black diamonds come from. It comes from their consumption. The economists, now the economists in all the universities and elsewhere, they have two basic ways of defining a middle class. Are they in the middle share of a national income distribution? The middle share of a national income distribution. In other words, are they the middle 20 or 30% in an array of income in a given country? Or on the other hand, do we define the middle class, again, essentially by lifestyle and what you have, by a level of affluence? If you're defining middle class in terms of a certain amount of income, a certain degree of affluence, your answer is going to be quite different from what you do if you're measuring just people who are in a statistical middle. So you get different answers by the ideology. I hope you can see this. It's a bit small. I couldn't manage to get it any better, being a bit of a technological dinosaur. But you will see that this comes from some of the leading economists on looking at the middle class, measuring the middle class in this country. And when they look at various economic data, they found the middle class, according to the income strata, was 15 million people in this country. We are talking about the middle class as a whole here, not just the black middle class. They saw the middle class in this country as being 15 million. It's 30% plus of the population, and it has just 13.2% of the total household income. If we look at the middle class in terms of affluence, the number of people goes down who are defined as middle class because of the definition of affluence that they chose to apply, and that's proportionally 20% of the population, but nearly 50% of household income in the country. So, sorry, this is just very simply to say, different approaches by economists are going to lead to different answers. And I think you'll say, well, which one is correct? And I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. I think basically economists would say we use different approaches for different reasons. There may be different policy reasons, for instance, in terms of looking at the terms of the middle class in terms of income or affluence. You also, just to show you the racial composition of the middle class, according to these same economists coming from the same survey, what we see here is, now this is taken in 2013. The black middle class in terms of income strata, according to their definition, the black middle class was 83% of the middle class, which seems very high, but it just shows the remarkable expansion of the black middle class. It's a fairly expansive definition. And in terms of affluence, they see the black middle class as having 49 or nearly 50%. So clearly you do get very different answers the way in which you approach the black middle class. Now, I'm a sociologist, so I tend to approach things rather differently. I tend to follow an approach which draws from both the Marxist and the Weberian traditions, but I argue that wealth and income and affluence sorry, I've written that. That's not very good English, is it? Basically, I'm arguing that we need to think of affluence and income as coming from work. How do we become rich? How do we become poor? It depends on what work we're doing and where we are in terms of the production which is produced in society. So I think it's important in terms of our thinking about class that we assess not just different levels of economic income and affluence, but in terms of economic and political power. So I'm drawing from both those traditions. And I also argue that I do think if we're thinking about a middle class, we do need to think about a middle class in terms of an overall class structure. Class is actually a relational idea. Middle is the relational word. It's in relation to upper classes, if you like, and lower classes. It makes no sense to think of a middle class unless we think of those other classes. And I think it's particularly important in South Africa for us to think, after 1994, to draw the distinction between economic power and political power, because we know that in this country they tend to be quite differentiated after 1994. There's the phrase, old money has economic power, new money has political power. And so I think we do need to combine class categories with occupations, with power and authority. And so this is how I tend to see the middle class, or located within the power structure in South Africa. I think what you will find in most of the, if we're looking at the tables produced by economists, you will simply get reference to an upper class and a lower upper and lower middle and so on and so forth in terms of a straightforward hierarchy. I think in terms of our trying to think this way through, I think there is an important distinction between the upper middle class and those at the very top of our society, a very small handful of people who distinguish themselves by the their huge level of affluence and the amount of property that they own. And this, of course, is increasingly a global situation where a very, very small number of people own huge assets in global terms. I saw a reference to the Trump cabinet, in which apparently 3 members of his cabinet own something like, they own more together than 30% of the American population. There was a report by Oxfam last week on the South African class structure suggesting that something like 8 people in this country, I can't remember what the statistic was huge, like own 50 or 60% of the wealth or something like that. Now, we can always query these measurements, but the important thing is there to remember that there is a very small number of people at the top who do own a lot. But it's important to distinguish between economic and political power. And so I tend to think in terms not just of income and affluence and occupation, which is this column, but how we actually try to think about these in terms of the power and authority they wield in society. Now, this sort of thing, frankly, is not really easily subject to measurement. I'm not suggesting it can't be measured, but I certainly can't measure it. I think one has to look at it in terms of political and social actions, probably over time, and to think of it, interpreting it in the way in which society actually moves along and the controversies into which we get ourselves. So this is the broad approach I'm going to take to black middle class, and in the next lecture I will be talking about, well, I've got too much to say actually. I've actually got 5 lectures and I've only got 4 to give them in. But I'm going to kick off, I think, about thinking about the black middle class and its relationship to the ANC, the way in which the ANC has promoted the black middle class since 1994. I may then link that directly to lifestyle, but I'm also going to be talking about the importance of education, and I'm going to be talking about the politics of the black middle class. But I was told to allow perhaps some time for questions, so I think that's what I'll do for the moment. So first of all, I hope I haven't bored you too much, because this is all definitional stuff and it's not jazzy. It's not talking probably about the things you wanted to talk about when you wanted to come and hear about the black middle class. I'm sure you're wanting to talk about lifestyles, talking about the educational system, but I'm going to be talking about that else at another time. But first of all, just to stress the point, I think if we're thinking about what is the black middle class, we have to think about what we're actually talking about. So, can I throw the ball out to you and ask for some questions? You'll have to speak up, because I'm as deaf as a post.
Thanks, Roger. Roger, you didn't elaborate on the role of the state in facilitating the middle class. I mean, you spoke a lot about income and the role of income, but if we look at the transition in South Africa as a state, where the nationalist government was a very, I suppose, developmental state, but only for white people, so it created a lot of subsidies around education and medical aid, and whereas the ANC was totally neoliberal, so the middle class, in fact, has to earn lots of money to pay for education and medical aid, and so so just maybe elaborate a little bit around the role of the state in facilitating class differentiation and what that can do to improve more inequality and have less disparities.
It's a very good question, because I think that one of the criticisms of, for instance, a lot of the World Bank literature, when it's talking about global middle classes, is that it actually tends to leave the state out. It's talking about the growth of middle classes, and it's really talking about the growth of the middle class in terms of the market and what they're contributing to the market and so on. But of course, the role of the state in creating middle classes across the board, not just South Africa, has been immense. The sort of policies which states put in place, the extent to which they facilitate movement between different segments of society, what sort of educational policies they put in place is extremely important. Now, if I answer your question now, I'm going to be preempting what I'm going to be saying in the next lecture. But it's just to simply say that since 1994, there has been a very conscious effort by the ANC government to promote a black middle class. It is sometimes made explicit, but very often it is left more implicit than explicit, because the ANC wants to see itself as promoting the welfare of all black people in this country particularly. So it does not want to sort of specify that, yes, there is a particular class which has done better than others. But I think there's been an extremely strong emphasis behind the promotion of the black middle class. And we will see in the next lecture the way in which particular policies have played out in terms of the very rapid expansion and upward mobility of the black middle class. So yes, the state plays an enormously important role. And the other aspect which I think is worth mentioning is that the state historically has played a hugely important role in this country in promoting middle classes. You mentioned the basically the notion of the development state before 1994, the way in which basically the national party governments from the 1920s used the state to promote employment, particularly for Afrikaans-speaking people, for Afrikaners, in terms of the opening up of the public in terms of promoting them in the public service, in terms of using the state enterprises to provide employment and to direct contracts to Afrikaner entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. And this, in many ways, many people argue that this is the model which the ANC has borrowed. And so, in fact, we're seeing something of a recycling of history. But we can leave that till next time round.
I understand how you basically numerically identify the LSMs as middle class, but how does one go about identifying affluence and creating a number and setting a number?
How do you go about creating?
How do you identify the middle class by affluence and putting a number to that?
It is done by basically the living standards measures, basically. And it is about what you own in terms of assets. So it's an asset-based approach. You could do it all sorts of ways. The living standards measures they do by these 20 indicators, fridges, God knows what. An alternative approach is the assets in terms of what wealth, I mean, not just income. I mean, this is very important. The distinction between income and wealth is very important. Income, obviously, is what you're getting in at the end of the month. Wealth is what you have got in the bank and have access to. And that is, as we will find out later in the lectures, this is a very key difference between the makeup of white and black middle classes in this country. If you take an asset-based approach to the middle classes in this country, broadly speaking, white middle class families tend to have a fair amount of assets behind them. On the other hand, black middle class people don't. And that's an important difference which we'll be exploring later on.
I just wanted to ask you about the relation between economic power and political power.
Let us say, I would say it's deeply contested. Obviously we see a lot of games being played out in between political power and economic power in this country. We're seeing it at the moment in all sorts of ways in terms of the debate so-called about state capture. On the one hand, people saying the state has been captured by Zuma and the Guptas. The response being, well, state capture was done previously by white monopoly capital and so on. So I think the relationship is very contested, but I think that another way of thinking about this is thinking in terms of business-state relationships and how in fact, the way in which business-state relationships play out is very important in terms of defining a country's trajectory. And what I think we find looking back before 1994, there was a relatively close connection between business and the state. It got a little bit testy in the 1970s and 1980s, but on the whole, there was a fairly close relationship. After 1994, of course, we see a significant dislocation between economic power and political power. And I think we are continuing to see many battles between those. One of the interesting things, of course, is what we're going to see. I'm talking about the black middle class. Now, I think many people tend to compress the emergence of a black elite with a black middle class. And I think it's actually quite important to distinguish between them. The black elite may be very, very small, but it definitely exists, and it is moving into the corporate boardrooms. It has done so through black economic empowerment and so on and so forth. The Cyril Ramaphosa's and Tokyo sexuality, etc. They are not just your ordinary black middle class people. They're not living in those small flats which we saw in the video. Huge numbers of people living on top of each other. They are a different class. But I think that whole issue of how we try to think of the relationship between the state and business is a very important one. And it plays a very important role in defining how closely a country's or how well an economics trajectory can do. Basically, the notion of a developmental stage, which many of you will read about extensively in the newspapers because it comes out of part of the ANC rhetoric. A developmental state, classically, in terms of the classic developmental states in post-war period, the South Koreas and the Japans and the Singapores and so forth have gone through they have succeeded because of a very close and functional relationship between business and the state. Very, very close. It's worked well. May say one of the key issues around the notion of a developmental state in this country is the highly contested relationship between the state, if you like, representative of nascent black capital, and the old established corporations and multinational corporations which are essentially depicted as white capital. It's a very difficult relationship, I think, in what is essentially a post-colonial society.
Can you clarify something for me?
Hello? Yes?
When you use the word black, do you mean African black or anyone that's not?
Again, when I'm talking about the black middle class, I'm talking about African black. But you're right, it's important in terms of defining what you mean in terms of black, because if you're looking at black economic empowerment, in theory at least, it refers also to Indians and coloureds and so on and so forth. But it does lead on to that other issue. What about the other middle classes of those other, in broad terms, black groupings? And why I chose to work on the black African middle class rather than the black middle class as a whole. The easiest answer to this is, for instance, there is quite a well-established Indian middle class in this country, but of course it's come through a very, very different historical trajectory to our present black African middle class. It's come through what we might term merchant capital in Durban. It has come through a long historical role of Indian merchant shops in townships and so forth, and it's used a lot of family labour to accumulate quite a considerable amount of capital. So it has had a very different historical development from our black middle class, which, as I shall be mentioning in the next lecture, when I'll be talking about partly the black middle class history, is our black middle class has been very, very small for various reasons connected with the racial history of this country. The coloured middle class, which is obviously very important, particularly in this part of the world, is something I simply am not particularly qualified to talk about at all. It's much more difficult to get at than if you're looking at the Indian middle class. Many more commonalities, I suspect, with the black middle class because of the relative poverty from which the coloured community is coming. But a more complete book would have looked at that, but again, I think there's a whole lot of other issues connected with it.
Your statistics that you presented to us earlier on, is this a countrywide investigation that was done to compile those statistics?
Yes, I mean, basically I can't, yes, it's, not provincial.
You see, I think this is a little bit misleading because if you take the various areas in this country, if you go to Gauteng, the Johannesburg, Pretoria area there, the encouragement for the black middle class is much greater than in Cape Town, for instance, where we have, and I hate these black, white, coloured, but where we have a big coloured population which is not being taken into account. And I think we who live in the Western Cape here are rather interested in seeing how the black middle class is going to affect us, because I believe with other people that the future lies in the growth of the middle class, and I think you've put this historically to us as well. So I believe that one has to look at particular areas and analyse particular areas rather than an overall.
I think you're absolutely right, and one of the lectures I'm going to give has got a very nice map borrowed from the Unilever Institute, which shows their, in terms of what they're measuring, the distribution of the black middle class around the country. And if I recall, the two stats which really stuck in my mind was they reckon that something like 46% of the black middle class is in Gauteng. 46%. And Western Cape, they just thought 3%. And I think that probably reflects the significant difference. Yeah.
So I'd like to just continue on this gentleman raised about the coloured middle class. My perception for a long time, living in Cape Town, is that the coloured population of Cape Town that their wealth has improved incredibly. And you only have to, and if you're going to measure assets and wealth, you only have to see the motor car ownership coming out of the traditional coloured middle class areas, Grassy Park, Mitchell's Plain, pouring along the R300 to work, pouring up Jan Smuts Drive, going to the banks, insurance companies. What was all white before are mainly coloured. And to me, and I don't think a lot of, again, perception, that a lot of coloured people have moved out of those traditional middle class areas where they've lived for years with council houses originally, maybe own them now. So their rentals or the cost of a roof over their head, and suddenly, or in a very